The only thing that could arrest and cure the disease was removal from the dry, cloud-hung surface of Venus and return to a moist, sunny climate on Earth. Without that treatment, once the typical mottled texture of the skin appeared, the flesh rapidly deteriorated and fell away in chunks. The victim remained unfevered and agonizingly conscious until the degeneration reached a vital spot. "If you have," said Sanchez, "you must realize that Diego cannot wait for a later ship. If his life is to be saved, he must get to Earth at once." Jan puffed at his Herenbai tobacco and cogitated. The place was aptly named. It was a ratty community. The boy was a dark-skinned little Spaniard, Mexican origin perhaps, but he was a boy and a human being. A thought occurred to him. From what he had seen and heard, the entire economy of Rathole could not support the tremendous expense of sending the boy across millions of miles to Earth by spaceship. "Who's paying his passage?" he asked. "The Dutch Central Venus Company isn't exactly a charitable institution." "Your Senor Dekker said that would be taken care of," replied Sanchez. Jan relit his pipe silently, making a mental resolution that Dekker wouldn't take care of it alone. Salaries for Venerian service were high, and many of the men at Oostpoort would contribute readily to such a cause. "Who is Diego's father?" he asked. "He was Ramon Murillo, a very good mechanic," answered Sanchez, with a sidelong glance at Jan's face. "He has been dead for 3 years." Jan grunted. "The copters at Oostpoort can't buck this wind," he said thoughtfully, "or I would have come in one of those in the first place instead of trying to cross Den Hoorn by land. But if you have any sort of aircraft here, it might make it downwind, if it isn't wrecked on takeoff." "I'm afraid not," said Sanchez. "Too bad. There's nothing we can do then. The nearest settlement west of here is more than 1,000 kilometers away, and I happen to know they have no planes either, just copters. So that's no help." "Wait," said Sanchez, lifting his scalpel and tilting his head. "I believe there is something, though we cannot use it. This was once an American naval base, and the people here were civilian employees who refused to move north with it. There was a flying machine they used for short-range work, and one was left behind, probably with a little help from the people of the settlement, but—" "What kind of machine? Copter or plane?" "They called it a flying platform. It carries 2 men, I believe, but, senor—" "Oh, I know them. I've operated them before I left Earth. Man, you don't expect me to try to fly one of those little things in this wind. They're as tricky as they can be, and the passengers are completely unprotected." "Senor, I have asked you to do nothing." "No, you haven't," muttered Jan. "But you know I'll do it." Sanchez looked into his face, smiling faintly and a little sadly. "I was sure you would be willing," he said. He turned and spoke in Spanish to Mrs. Murillo. The woman rose to her feet and came to them. As Jan arose, she looked up at him, tears in her eyes. "Gracias," she murmured. "Un millón de gracias." She lifted his hands in hers and kissed them. Jan disengaged himself gently, embarrassed. But it occurred to him, looking down on this bowed head of a beautiful young widow, that he might be making some flying trips back over here in his leisure time. Language barriers were not impassable, and feminine companionship might cure his neurotic, history-born distaste for Spaniards, for more than one reason. Sanchez was tugging at his elbow. "Senor, I have been trying to tell you," he said. "It is generous and good of you, and I wanted Senora Murillo to know what a brave man you are. But have you forgotten that we have no gasoline engines here? There is no fuel for the flying platform." The platform was in a warehouse which, like the rest of the structures in Rathole, was a half-buried dome. The platform's ring-shaped base was less than a meter thick, standing on 4 metal legs. On top of it, in the center, was a railed circle that could hold 2 men, but would crowd them. 2 small gasoline engines sat on each side of this railed circle, and between them on the third side was the fuel tank. The passengers entered it on the forced side. The machine was dusty and spotted with rust. Jan, surrounded by Sanchez, Diego, and a dozen men, inspected it thoughtfully. The letters USN*SES were painted in white on the platform itself, and each engine bore the label Hiller. Jan peered over the edge of the platform at the twin-ducted fans in their plastic shrouds. They appeared in good shape. Each was powered by one of the engines, transmitted to it by heavy rubber belts. Jan sighed. It was an unhappy situation. As far as he could determine without making tests, the engines were in perfect condition. 2 perfectly good engines, and no fuel for them. "You're sure there's no gasoline anywhere in Rat Hole?" he asked Sanchez. Sanchez smiled ruefully, as he had once before, at Jan's appellation for the community. The inhabitants' term for it was simply La Ciudad Nuestra, our town. But he made no protest. He turned to one of the other men and talked rapidly for a few moments in Spanish. "None, senor," he said, turning back to Jan. "The Americans, of course, kept much of it when they were here, but the few things we take to Oostpoort to trade could not buy precious gasoline. We have electricity in plenty if you can power the platform with it." Jan thought that over, trying to find a way. "No, it wouldn't work," he said. "We could rig batteries on the platform and electric motors to turn the propellers, but batteries big enough to power it all the way to Oostpoort would be so heavy the machine couldn't lift them off the ground. If there's some way to carry a power line all the way to Oostpoort, or to broadcast the power to it, but it's a light load machine and must have an engine that gives it all the necessary power from very little weight." Wild schemes ran through his head. If they were on water instead of land, he could rig up a sail. He could still rig up a sail for a ground car, except for the chasm out on Den Hoorn. The ground car! Jan straightened and snapped his fingers. "Doctor," he explained, "send a couple of men to drain the rest of the fuel from my ground car, and let's get this platform above ground and tie it down until we can get it started." Sanchez gave rapid orders in Spanish. 2 of the men left at a run, carrying 5-gallon cans with them. 3 others picked up the platform and carried it up a ramp and outside. As soon as they reached ground level, the wind hit them. They dropped the platform to the ground, where it shuddered and swayed momentarily, and 2 of the men fell successfully on their stomachs. The wind caught the third and somersaulted him half a dozen times before he skidded to a stop, on his back with outstretched arms and legs. He turned over cautiously and crawled back to them. Jan, his head just above ground level, surveyed the terrain. There was flat ground to the east, clear and a fairly broad alley for at least half a kilometer before any of the domes protruded up into it. "This is as good a spot for takeoff as we'll find," he said to Sanchez. The men put 3 heavy ropes on the platform's windward rail and secured it by them to the heavy chain that ran by the dome. The platform quivered and shuddered in the heavy wind, but its base was too low for it to overturn. Shortly, the 2 men returned with the fuel from the ground car, struggling along the chain. Jan got above ground in a crouch, clinging to the rail of the platform, and helped them fill the fuel tank with it. He primed the carburetors and spun the engines. Nothing happened. He turned the engines over again. One of them coughed, and a cloud of blue smoke burst from its exhaust, but they did not catch. "What is the matter, senor?" asked Sanchez from the dome entrance. "I don't know," replied Jan. "Maybe it's that the engines haven't been used in so long. I'm afraid I'm not a good enough mechanic to tell." "Some of these men were good mechanics when the Navy was here," said Sanchez. "Wait." He turned and spoke to someone in the dome. One of the men of Rat Hole came to Jan's side and tried the engines. They refused to catch. The man made carburetor adjustments and tried again. No success. He sniffed, took the cap from the fuel tank, and stuck a finger inside. He withdrew it, wet and oily, and examined it. He turned and spoke to Sanchez. "He says that your ground car must have a diesel engine," Sanchez interpreted to Jan. "Is that correct?" "Why, yes, that's true." He says the